Where's the nation state involved by this? And in most cases, I'm talking about the United States federal government. The state is always a key partner in creating economies. It's really actually the state is the thing within which even a free market economy exists. So the state, in a sense, is primary, but what do they do? What's the level of participation and influence? We do know that they always do things like protect land and geographies, right? That's what the Army is for. They help to acquire new lands and new resources, and they set up trade agreements so that businesses can do the same. They establish and they regulate markets. And so markets are actually a production of the state through several things. One, they create and maintain a currency, and that medium of exchange is critical. And the US dollar is still the medium of exchange on the global markets. Although in the 19th century, let's remember, gold was the foundation of economic wealth. So they create and maintain currencies, and they facilitate markets through both creating and facilitating transportation and creating and facilitating communication. And so there's a critical role for the state, and we'll look at where and how and in which ways they get involved. And then the fourth is the ideas that emerge out of all of this. What are the ideas that we carry about the economy? How is it idealized and imagined in the period under review? The image we see here is an imagination at the end of the 19th century of United States surplus being sold to China. And this is part of an argument for the annexation of the Philippines and the creation of a colony, the US first colony, because it's a stepping stone to, and you can see by the grimace on Uncle Sam's face, to unload this burden of surplus and overproduction that our markets at home aren't capable of absorbing. Critical idea that drove American imperialism. And so we'll be asking, what are the ideas about the economy that are held by Americans in different periods of time? Today, we're going to look at the patterns of economic change from the early industrialization in New England, which was a water power-based industrialization making textiles and household luxuries, to a fossil fuel-based raw material production system that was, as the image we just saw suggested, glutting the nation with what appeared to be a material oversupply. We're going to be looking at the same demographics, the same demographic change from this peak on the first frontier in 1850, right? The expansion of the edge of the Great Plains, out of which the second frontier grew. And it's out of this, especially the growing metal processing center of Pittsburgh, which you can see in this graph. So we're going to see the earliest days through to this, right? Which we might note continues to be a nation dominated by the East and dominated by Eastern cities, Boston and New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and these are now supplemented by interior cities, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Chicago, St. Louis, and New Orleans, all becoming major conduits to the far west. And then way out west, the very beginnings of a West Coast centered in San Francisco. All right, so from the 1850s to 1900 and these changes, let's get some definitions clarified before we go. So we're going to use some words that we all use, everybody uses them, we throw them around. I want precise definitions, and these are the precise definitions that I am going to be using as I use this term throughout the lectures. So capitalism. Capitalism, as it says there, is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. So trade and industry, things we buy and build and sell, are all organized by private owners who are doing those things for profit. Okay, and that's capitalism. And that, I'm arguing, is the system that the United States has been participating in. Let me go the other way. Here's another term that gets bandied about. We might contrast capitalism with socialism, and we really should define it precisely as well, because this is a definition, both of them, in fact, that come from Karl Marx. Marx argued that capitalism itself, the system was built upon an inherent contradiction between the value in the economy, which was coming from labor and workers, and the people who took that value as profit, the bourgeoisie, or the owners of capital, or the capitalists, as he called them. He said that this will eventually lead to a contradiction that breaks the society, transforming the nation state from being something that built and protected the free markets like it did in capitalism, to something that owned all of the trade and industry in order to begin to favor the labor, in order to put the value where it belonged, in labor itself. And capitalists would first disappear, coming into socialism. So state run, all of the value goes back to the workers. And Marx says, this is because the capitalists actually make nothing for themselves. Let's just stop for a minute. Most of the people, including our politicians like Bernie Sanders and AOC in Congress, who are calling for socialism today, don't mean this at all. They don't mean the Marxist term and the strict definition of this. They mean something more like, we need to have better public education, and we need to have better access to medical knowledge for people without resources. They mean something like, we need higher minimum wages, and we need more opportunities for people to participate in the market economy. They don't mean socialism in this Marxist technical sense of the term, but I will when I use it in my lectures. And for Marx, the next step after this, after socialism, was the state disappeared and the whole system just ran on its own volition of laborers running their own factories and doing all of the things that needed to be done. It's probably this stage in which we can say this idea perished in Soviet Russia, and that has gone into some really interesting evolutions in China, both of which still have very powerful states controlling trade and resources. And let's just round out these definitions of economic social forms, because Marx argued that capitalism was a stage that had followed an earlier stage called feudalism. And there, if you know anything about the Middle Ages, this is about these sort of small hierarchies of noble lords and kings who owned large tracts of land, where people who are, whether they're peasants or they're serfs, are doing manual labor. Their whole family is, in order to maintain their household and in order to produce a surplus for the lord or the manor, and in return they get protected. And this was a form that emerged in Europe in particular. And Marx said, okay, out of feudalism, the people who did their best as peasants became the bourgeoisie and the owners of production, ultimately, and the capitalists. Marx has given us some really powerful tools to think about our world, and he's given us some very powerful tools to think about history, and we want to use them carefully, and we want to use them precisely. And this is why I lay this out this way. Without question, capitalism, and Marx was looking at the United States as much as he was looking at England and Germany, and when he was writing Das Kapital, his great work on capitalism. But without a doubt, capitalism is the system being fostered and developed in the United States in a general sense. The ideals that we talk about when we talk about political freedom are in many ways in the United States inseparable from the ideals of economic freedom. And so when we talk about capitalism and the politics and the economics of it, we also end up engaging in political discussions, because it's just very difficult to separate those things in our discourse. But today we want to talk about the economy and think about the economy. So let's go back to this 1850 map. We can think about this whole first frontier of development as a way in which the United States worked to create a capitalist nation on the back of mostly organic sources of energy. And so that really, the first half of the 19th century was an organic expression of capitalism. It was wood being burned. It was falling water. It was animals working. And then it was the most efficient of all animals. It was human beings working as well. When we think about the agrarian ideal of Thomas Jefferson, what he imagined when he said this frontier could last 1,000 generations was an organic-based capitalism, right? Small family farms, communities of farmers, small manufacturers, lots of trade, lots of industry taking place. And this space that we're looking at in this map filled up very much in this way. The key energy and transportation element was water, right? An organic source of power. Water falling is actually solar energy, because the sun evaporated the water and moved it to the top of the mountain, and then gravity pulled it down. So water energy or solar energy captured in water. From about the 1820s onward, it was harvested for mills to work mass production grain and lumber across the Northeast and down the mid-Atlantic. And it was water power that eventually spawned the massive textile works in and around Lowell, Massachusetts. Water power. At the same time, control of water transportation through canal building laced New England, and then got us connected across New York and the upper Midwest in this tangle of canals, and created the first single market system in the United States, at least across the northern tier. In 1825, and you can see why in the map in the center, New York completed the massive Erie Canal project, which connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River. You can see in the middle of this map, there's a low point through the middle of New York, and they used that to dig their canal. They connected some rivers together, a couple of small lakes, and got to the Hudson. This larger map is the elevation profile of the canal itself. So there are several places where they had to use locks to drop it significantly. But this was about creating a national market. And over the next quarter of the century, from 1825 to 1850, canal building remade the markets of the upper Midwest, connecting places without river access and making river travel more efficient. And these key transportation networks were financed by the sale of public bonds. That is, people who had surplus money could invest their money and earn a small return on this investment over time. By the 1850s, these were the primary avenue of movement of goods and market exchange, and we include the canals and the lakes, Great Lakes, and the rivers. This was the primary foundation of market exchange, except in New England. But these canals had critical limitations. First of all, the canals were essentially standing water. They were not moving water, they were not rivers, which meant that much more rapidly than rivers do, these canals filled up with debris and detritus. And so over time, the cost of maintenance on these things got higher and higher and higher. So they're expensive to make, and they're increasingly more expensive to keep open. Worse, in this region, they were useless for 2 to 4 months of the year. Markets had to shut down because this region locked itself in a hard freeze, and you can't run canal boats on frozen water. So they had these major inefficiencies built into them. I mentioned, though, New England had a slightly different story, and you can see there's a couple canals in New England, but mostly New England, I seem to have lost my New England map. New England hadn't really lent itself to canal digging the way that upper New York and the upper Midwest did. So you can see some of the development there in New England. And so they developed a different form. And it was a form that in England was rooted in coal energy, fossil fuel energy. And this was the railroad. It had grown out of the railroads 50 years earlier. It had grown out of the coal mines 50 years earlier. But the railroads that were built up in New England were still organic, and we're still using organic energy. That is, there was so much forest that New England railroads were actually organic based and wood powered. And here we see the staged development of the railroads in the United States. They start locally, really hyper locally, just in a couple places in the 30s. They become interstate, particularly along the Atlantic coast and the North Atlantic coast in the 40s. And then they become regional by the 1850s. But again, kind of really concentrated on the East Coast. It's a little hard to see the railroads in this picture, but if you look closely, you can make them out. They're the things that aren't rivers lacing across this map of New England. By 1850, New England actually had the most developed railroad, covering the area between southern Maine and New York City with a really dense network of roads. And this installation demonstrated the economic superiority of railroad transportation over canal. So by 1850, there was already a solution to the economic efficiencies that we were experiencing in the canal building. Railroads can run any season. They have a lower construction cost and they have a lower maintenance cost. You're not trying to dig out and move water and keep it clean. And the use of mechanical energy could be made out of wood. And that was a primary energy source. So wood steam could run these things effectively. There were apparently enough for us and were for this first stage to build. And in fact, if we look back at the 1850s map again, we notice that the railroads distinguish the industrialized region from the rest of the nation. Railroads are critical in this new market. So wood-powered, water-based transportation, creating larger interconnected markets in the new nation. But all of the energy is concentrated along this East Coast, almost all of it. There's a couple of exceptions. And all of the energy is concentrated along this East Coast because in an organic economy, most of the energy is concentrated along the East Coast. When we're talking about water power mills, and water power is the primary industrial motor. It's running the textile mills, it's running the flour mills, it's running the lumber mills, it's providing energy to furniture makers and watchmakers and barrel makers. But water power only exists where a whole lot of water already falls through space. And there's only a few places where that happens, right? This required what geologists call a fall line. What you're seeing on this red line here along the East Coast is the fall line of the East Coast. It stretches from central New Hampshire all the way to central Georgia, although it gets pretty low as you get down into the southern states. It's the point at which the Appalachian Mountains end and an eroded coastal plain begins. And it's the only place along the East Coast where there's sufficient fall, a sufficient drop to provide sufficient energy to keep mills running, sufficient energy for what would become an ambitious and growing market economy. And so the industrial core grew along the Northeast coast, connected by railroads and creating a growing demand for resources. Its key demand, its biggest industry was textile, its key demand was cotton and blue dye to dye the cotton from its kind of dingy brown white to a dark blue. And the demand from the textile industry in the Northeast, starting in the 1840s and running through the middle of the century, starting in the 1830s, running through the middle of the century, intensified and grew the practice of slavery in the South. And we're going to look at some of these numbers next time. But it, in fact, industrialization, if it's such a thing as possible, made slavery even more miserable by the middle of the 19th century. And it grew an internal market of slave trade and the trade in slave that intensified as well, which meant the increased separation of families and family members who were still trapped in this system at a greater rate during this period than at any other time in US history. And the American slave labor population literally grew, and it grew in a period of time when international slave trade was closed off, which meant it grew internally, which meant that mothers and fathers were having their children taken from them and sold to other people in order to keep this slave trade alive. Not only did that population grow, but the acreage of land planted by cotton by slave owners grew exponentially in response to this demand. All of this to supply the hungry textile mills of New England, which were churning out cloth for a growing American population and a growing market in Europe as well. The East Coast industrial core also required more food energy than ever. And so this region, the agricultural heartland, we might call it, began to create economies of scale in corn production feed production and pigs in particular for protein. Cincinnati became the capital of pork in the first half of the 19th century in order to feed this market, right? So it's a national market, but it's got regional specializations that are growing. By 1850, we saw this in a few slides earlier, but let's remember the upper Midwest was laced with canals that connected it with eastern railroads and did literally stitch together a coherent national economy containing these regional specialties with a decided power core, financial and industrial core running along the East Coast from Baltimore to Boston. And New York City was the heart of that and the most powerful of all of the cities. And a decided resource periphery to this core in the South and in the Midwest. We can look at a cleaned, no labeled topographical map. That shows the elevation of the whole region. And we can say the way in which these separate functions actually aligned with the topographical natural conditions of each region in a really interesting way. New England had the steepest fall lines and the most well-developed railroad transportation systems because they needed to connect this really busy landscape in this way. The South had the Piedmont, that enormous green stretch you see running from Virginia, from Maryland, from South Jersey, all the way down to Georgia and Alabama. Lush, warm, deep soils in a warm climate for cotton growing. And then the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi Valley you see underneath Lake Michigan and Lake Huron and Lake Erie, rich, fertile soils as well, suited to grow large acreage of corn, flat enough to be able to mass plant and mass harvest. But so as this region is settling into its own, you might say, organic self, some new developments are emerging right out of its middle. The beginning of even more important resources for this region: coal, copper, and iron. And so I talked last time about the mining impulse that came to dominate the far western frontier. It actually began in the upper Midwest a decade earlier, in the 1840s. Coal, and then copper, and then iron ore, which together would shake the economy free of some of its geographic dependencies and liberate this economy to work harder in more places. Okay, let's start with the coal. Coal discoveries in Western Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, what would later become West Virginia, coal was first discovered there in the early 1840s, and it began what would become a major and still ongoing coal mining industry for this whole region. The growing urban centers in the East and the upper Midwest consumed far more firewood than the forests could produce for heat. And so there was a gradual shift in our eastern cities to a coal-fired heat. Coal was first used to heat homes because between the railroad and these urbanizations, forests were literally disappearing in New England. But it was clear to the coal discoverers, the producers, that they had way, way, way more coal than was needed for just heat. Copper, so copper in the Lake Superior, upper Michigan. This is native copper. This is copper that's coming out of the ground as copper, which is exceptionally rare, and which this deposit is the largest of its kind ever found on Earth. And in fact, Americans have known for a long time that there were deposits of native copper way up in Lake Superior. They'd known for almost 100 years, but it was far too remote. There was not access to transportation or communication to make it of any value, because you actually had to do quite a bit of work to get it out of the ground and work it. But as that agrarian frontier began to expand across the upper Midwest, and the canal transportation began to open that region for markets after the Erie Canal, new states began to form out of the territory that had been public land. And originally, the whole region west of Ohio had been called Indiana Territory. But in 1835, a new territory called Michigan a new state called Michigan formed out of Eastern Indiana Territory. And one of the first things that the legislature of the state did was it appropriated $3,000 to do a complete survey of the copper deposits of their new state, and then provide bonds to develop transportation up there. So by 1841, they had a great sense of what deposits they had, and they had all the data on that. And by 1844, there were railroads leading up into this region, and a company called the Boston and Pittsburgh, emphasizing both that old powerful city of finance, Boston, and this emerging new city of Pittsburgh. The Boston and Pittsburgh Mining Company was formed, and it began using Pennsylvania coal to exploit Michigan copper, which was at that point a fairly valuable metal. It got much cheaper when the West started producing, and it was used for roofing and for statues and other things, but it was about almost going after coinage when they were going after this copper, because it was a high value metal that they could simply pull out of the ground. Within 4 years of the discovery of the exploitation of these known copper reserves, the same mining ambitions would uncover what would turn out to be one of the world's largest deposits of iron ore. And these are deposits that were laid down a couple billion years ago in the great oxygenation event. So they come out of Earth history, laid down at the bottom of shallow seas. First in Michigan, and then north, you can see there of Lake Superior in what would become the state of Minnesota. This iron would become the steel in the rails and the bridges and the I-beams and the machinery and the tools and the ammunition and the weapons. And by the turn of the century, it would have provided a modern urban industrial infrastructure to the modernizing United States, this material in those red bands. It would be hauled by rail car to Pittsburgh or Cleveland or Youngstown, where it would be married to the anthracite coal from the Appalachian Mountains and smelted and refined into the future world of iron and steel and railroads and eventually steel towers to the sky. But it didn't get there because of just these 3 discoveries. In fact, we looked last time at what the motor of this change actually was. The California gold discoveries in 1848, 1849 were an unexpected icing on the cake of this whole system, and in fact ended up transforming it. This mining practice would send more than $500 million in bullion, specie, in gold, the stuff that is money, gold bullion. It would send $500 million back east to the emergent coal, iron, and copper industries in the East, okay, just in the first decade. So this was a significant volume and value of gold, significant enough to impact the national economy. It peaked in 1852, as you can see on this chart, at 3,000 ounces a year, and amounted to a little over $540 million new dollars in the 1850s. That is brand new money, right? And a growing gold supply meant a growing economy. It meant money for investment as it came back east. And it was invested by these same forces that were beginning to see a fossil fuel future into a whole new infrastructure and a whole new development and a whole new economy in the agricultural heartland, transforming this region into a material production, fabrication, and manufacturing region, and eventually in the 20th century, what we would call the Steel Belt. Spending gold from California on steel refined with Pennsylvania coal and Michigan iron, and most of this was taking place in Pittsburgh and Cleveland, and a new industry in the East, a forestry industry, cross ties that are cut out of timber pulled from the vast pine forests of upper Wisconsin and upper Alabama, and built and developed dozens of railroads and railroad carriers and a vast network of railroad businesses that very quickly in the 1850s surpassed and supplanted the canal network and launched the first fossil fuel energy-based industrialization in US history. This is the first fossil fuel-based industrialization. It's different. And so this is what it looked like by 1860, 10 years later. It was a shift from the organic energy of the past into the fossil fuel-based energy of modernization. And at least for New England and the Midwest, railroads and their concomitant telegraph communication now form the foundation of the future industrialization. By 1860, this is what we're doing. We've made the shift. The frontier that we'll mention this again at the end, Frederick Jackson Turner said ended in 1892, might have ended in the 1850s, because we see the impact, right? We can see it in the urban development. There's New York City in 1850. It was already a beast of a city, but there was only one city like New York City. There was only one city with more than 250,000 people in 1850. But this investment in manufacturing was establishing the future of cities and the future foundation and material foundation of cities up and down the East Coast and along key waterways on the interior. So that by 1860, these cities have ballooned. New York and Philadelphia have just expanded exponentially. Boston, Baltimore, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Chicago have all expanded significantly as well. There are 9 cities in all with more than 50,000 people, with more than 250,000 people by 1860. So by 1860, in this 10-year period of time, the northern urban industrial resource extraction and manufacturing economy was underway. It was built up. Why is that not working? It was built up on the expansion of transportation through railroads and communication through the telegraph. And so we might think about this for just a minute in this weird inversion of experiences. At the very same time in the 1850s that the United States was geographically doubling in size and adding this far west geography to its nation, it was at the same time shrinking the space in the core and in the space that it occupied anywhere that a railroad reached. The railroad made transportation quicker over space, and the telegraph allowed instant communication anywhere that telegraph wires reached. By 1860s, you can see that the railroads laced the Midwest into a single market, connected to the east by several rail lines. You might also, just as you look at this, compare the extent of railroad development in the north versus railroad development in the south, whom we will soon go to war with. So these railroads, I just mentioned this, not only moved goods into the market at a faster rate, they literally shrunk the experience of space. They reduced travel time across this whole region. And just to give you a couple of examples, in 1830, it took someone about 3 weeks to get from New York to Chicago. And that was the fastest route over the Great Lakes, across the Erie Canal, down the Hudson. In 1857, it took just 2 days by railroad. It still took 4 weeks to get to San Francisco in the far west, but even then, more space, less time to travel over it. And the success of these railroads in the 1850s and the way in which they facilitated the markets that grew and the market growth in the 1850s and the growing manufacturing base and the attraction of labor, et cetera, grew into not just a regional, but a national argument by 1863. Now, we will remember, I'll talk about this next week. This is in the middle of the Civil War, right? So this is a war-divided Congress that's passing this, but this is a war-divided Congress that is dominated by the northern states that have developed this urban industrial resource extraction, fossil fuel industry and the growth. And they want to expand it westward. And they want to expand it westward by expanding railroads, westward. So in 1863, Congress wrote and Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act. That actually be 4 additional acts. Talk about this next week. But essentially, the concept was, let's leverage the vast publicly owned lands in the far west that are not being settled at this point in order to pay for these transcontinental lines. Excuse me, the first of them would be completed in 1869. By 1890, there'd be 5 of them reaching across the far west. And all of that yellow that you see is what's called land grant land act land. Congress gave away 174 million acres of land. That's what these yellow sections are. Essentially, they gave the title of the land to railroads so that the railroad could then, one, it was the space where they're going to run their road, but it's expanded well beyond that space so they could turn it into timber or metals if they were there, or even more lucrative real estate like railroad towns and cities where they could sell this to new homeowners, etc. 174 million acres. So what is that? Let's put it in perspective. That is 6 Ohios. 6 complete Ohios were given away by the United States to the railroad, private concerns, railroad industries, 6 Ohios of real estate to accomplish this national task, to create a national network of railroads. And it worked. It worked. I mean, there's just no question about it. By 1890, these roads were in. This region was developed. In fact, in 1883, when most of the transcontinental railroads have been completed, and at a point in time when we could send messages instantly from San Francisco to New York, and train travel was reduced from 3.5 days between New York and San Francisco. So again, let's put this in perspective. Before the railroad was in place, beginning of the 19th century, a person could walk about 100 miles in a day, in 3.5 days. So a person could walk, if they're at a brisk pace, going about 8 or 9 hours a day from New York to Philadelphia. By 1880s, the same person can get on a train and get to San Francisco in 3.5 days. Larger distances, less time. And at this point, railroads became so important in the national economy that all of us became subjects of the railroad themselves in terms of our temporal existence. We all became part of railroad time, something we hardly notice today. We call it the time zones today. But this was a construction of this technology itself, spread across this vast expanse of space. The need for companies, railroad companies, to keep their trains on schedule, to help people understand when trains were arriving. All of that required a greater precision of timekeeping than had ever been necessary before. And so for these companies, in order to facilitate this national scheduling, train companies had already among themselves adopted this practice. And they had agreed upon regular time zones and breaking the United States down into 4 regular time zones. In 1883, Congress passed this as the national law, establishing 4 time zones in the contiguous United States. Now, the lines you see in this initial picture have changed because we've got much more precise in terms of measuring some things. But this practice continues to this day with us living in Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific time zones across the United States. They not only took control of our temporal reality, these railroads, they not only took control of the rhythm of our day, but the institutional solutions that railroads found to their management problems, which were management problems across space with multiple heterogeneous pieces trying to tack into a system that had to aggregate in some way. How railroads solved that became a practice for American investors and industrial titans later in the century. And so you're looking at the model, you've seen this if you've taken a business class. Initially, this idea emerged in railroads. That is to say, they had a problem and they had to solve it. Management hierarchies became the way to solve it. And you might just compare a railroad to those older watermill grist mills, for example, or a family-owned grocery. All of the businesses before the railroads in the United States were geographically fixed in one place. And then they had a regular set of buyers, people they bought from, people they sold to, who they knew personally. And they had usually a family that worked around it. So there was this sort of market node that a business represented. Railroads were something altogether different. They were working to move extremely large metal objects filled with incredibly valuable freight belonging to hundreds of thousands of different people across vast geographies of space and time, and have everybody involved to be able to predict where and when they were going to be doing this stuff. Really complicated problem. You had to be able to schedule your trains, provide the right tickets, load supplies and people, drop off supplies and people, and do so for several train cars going in multiple directions over the course of any given day. And for most of these railroads, often this took place on a single track that ran both directions. So they had to make sure they didn't run trains into each other. Never mind coordinating all of those employees, all of the fuel costs, and any accidents that might happen along the way. Railroads found that the only way they could spread across space the way that they did was to create what we now know as the management hierarchy, to control these variables and maintain order in the system. And it started from the local and grew up. So local stations had specific responsibilities and reporting requirements to regional managers, who in turn aggregated these reports to vice presidents, who reported to an executive team who was thinking about the financing of the whole network, led by the chief executive themselves. Subdividing these functions and establishing these reporting responsibilities helped to keep the right level of detail in view at the right level of management. And in the end, it worked. It ensured that trains arrived on schedule, that they had passengers waiting for them and getting off, that there was freight there to load and freight there to unload. And they ensured that most of the time, there were some horrible accidents early on, that all of the trains in the system had been inspected and maintained on a regular basis. So this is this management hierarchy was a solution to a problem. It was an institutional solution to a problem that emerged out of the problem that railroads presented. But this a Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Visible Hand by Alfred Chandler, was actually written a long time ago, 1977, said that these management hierarchies, well, one, he traced their origin in the railroads, but he said, and he really demonstrated, this structure very quickly migrated into the resource extraction economy and beyond. And it became a new practice of business enterprises. That is, they would engage management hierarchies in order to manage larger units which had been absorbed into the business themselves. And Chandler's argument is, without the railroad having pioneered this business form, it wouldn't have been ready and available for the industrialists who took it up starting in the 1870s. I'm going to talk about two pioneering examples of this. You probably heard of them before. Hopefully this puts them in a whole new context. They are the pioneers of the fossil fuel urban industrial management hierarchy economy. Before I do, though, I want to just briefly talk about what Chandler found. Why are these hierarchies working? And he said that there was this set of technological innovations in the late 19th century, railroads and other mass movement technologies, that allowed companies to move more material at once, and that by creating management hierarchies, they could also create unprecedented efficiencies in these businesses. Because when you begin to move more material at once, you're shortening the number of people and times that it's being offloaded and onloaded. And these efficiencies caused these new businesses that engaged in this to literally balloon with wealth, to grow at a rate that we had never seen in human histories. Chandler said these efficiencies came from several places at once. It was kind of a confluence of things. They came from better communication, in particular, the instant communication of the telegraph, which allowed for better coordination of the supply chain. You knew what your mine was producing on the day it was producing it, and facilitated the centralized coordination of a cradle to grave resource material fabrication production system. Okay, so it was efficiencies ultimately, and it was ways of reorganizing technology and people that created profits that had been really unheard of in human history. And so let's look at a couple of examples. We all know Rockefeller. Rockefeller is the icon of sort of robber barons or great capitalists. He was the founder of Standard Oil. He was really one of the first individuals to begin to enlist the strategy of management hierarchy. He was from Cleveland, an Ohio guy. We're going to see a lot of Ohio guys in the 19th century. He was America's first billionaire, and that was because of how much wealth the system he put together produced. And in real dollars, some economic historians say he probably still is the wealthiest person that ever lived. And that's because the value of dollar changes over time. And so our billionaires today are still not as wealthy as John Rockefeller was at the dawn of the 20th century because of what he accomplished here. He started with numbers and accounting. So it was a sort of natural fit for him probably to adopt management hierarchies. He started when he was 16 in 1855 in Cleveland, which was then the middle of the 50s, right in the heart of these wealth building activities, the coal and the iron and the railroads and all of these developments around high volume production of raw materials. And just kind of got the lay of the land and got to know people, and he saved his money. And in 1859, so we've been saving money for about 4 years, oil was discovered in Western Pennsylvania. And so this is not the oil discovery of Texas where there's so much demand, people know they're going to be gazillionaires. This is actually a very conservative investment on his part, because all that oil was used for at that time was for illumination. Oil was refined, and it was slightly cheaper than the whale oil that most people had used for their indoor lights and some public illumination. And so in 1870, he invested in this. In 1870, he founded a company that started to process the kerosene, the Standard Oil Company. At that point, he was one of several oil refiners in the Cleveland area. There are some in Pittsburgh as well. And he noted how oil brokers would often play the refineries off one another. The guys who were pulling it out of the ground would try to get the lowest price that they could. And he was trying to get oil at the lowest price he could and sell kerosene at the highest. He also more than likely visited and paid very careful attention to this development in Massachusetts, the Washburn and Moen manufacturing company. This company had developed the first monopoly in the United States, and it was a monopoly over wire, and particularly barbed wire production in the late 60s, early 70s. This barbed wire, there's a sudden demand for it as ranchers move out to the Great Plains because there's no trees and there's no way to build fences. And so this ballooning demand was recognized by Washburn and Moen, who started buying out all of the wire manufacturers in New England, in New York, in New Jersey. So that it would, and then it would grow its factory to meet the demand. So it would buy out a factory, it would shut it down, it would expand its factory. This strategy of buying out other industries in your space in the supply chain is called horizontal integration. And I'm sure you've heard this term before. It means becoming the biggest producer at some bottleneck place in a supply chain production cycle so that you can determine the price. And so for Washburn and Moen, it meant becoming the largest producer of barbed wire and telegraph wire, as it turned out, and owning that, which meant that they were now the largest buyer of iron and zinc raw materials, and they could determine the price. It meant they were the largest seller of that wire going out into the economy, and so they could determine the price. This monopoly, as we call them, over single industries, it gave the company what some began to see as an unfair advantage in the marketplace. Was this real competition? If someone got so big, they could just suck up all the other ones and disappear them. And the monopolists in turn would say, we're lowering the price and creating efficiencies and creating more wealth. Monopolies often are early on, and we'll see this with Standard Oil, could shut out other buyers and sellers if they didn't agree to the monopoly price. And it gave them these increasing returns as they grew their production in these economies of scale, which allowed them to reap higher and higher profits off of the material that they were working. So more material with a marginally high profit means a whole lot more profit. And those savings in turn meant they could lower their price below competitors and stay solvent and continue to compete, right? So monopolies created out of horizontal integration, like Washburn and Moen, like Standard Oil would do around oil refining, which is what we're seeing here, essentially take one step in a supply chain and own and control that single bottleneck and achieve an economy of scale by doing so. For Rockefeller, it was the oil refineries. Once Rockefeller owned a majority of them, he could determine the fate of the rest, and he did. He bought them and he shut them down. He bought them and he shut them down. And they managed their growing scale, and we see Rockefeller do this, and we saw Washburn and Moen do this as well, their growing scale of operation by enlisting the management hierarchy that the railroads pioneered. And Rockefeller was, we know, wildly successful at this effort. By 1897, he had built Standard Oil, which was still, by 1897, still only producing kerosene for nighttime illumination in the cities that were now booming around the United States. He turned a kerosene firm into the largest business in the country by essentially owning all of the oil production and refining. Now, when automobiles come along about 20 years later and begin to make oil refining exponentially more valuable, Rockefeller gained all of that advantage. But the cars weren't there to start with. It was about grabbing a market that people were fairly dependent on and that was fairly consistent, horizontally integrating it and using a management hierarchy to manage the scope of work that you're doing. Bottleneck monopolies were one strategy. The other was to buy out the whole supply chain itself, to buy out everything from the ore mining to the iron rail production. And Andrew Carnegie was the guy who accomplished this feat. He, interestingly enough, got his first investment profits from oil field investments in Pennsylvania as well. He turned those profits into a steel empire. He had been himself a railroad manager, so he was intimately familiar with the management hierarchies that the railroads used to manage their various things. And he brought this into steel production. He said, I think we can do something great here. Mass production, right? So he learned from the experience of Rockefeller and recognized that if you adopt early a mass production technique, particularly in a core processing area, you can be successful. So he was one of the first in the United States to engage Bessemer processing. And this was a major innovation, brand new when he got started with it and not entirely proven. This allowed him to have ironworks capable of a mass processing that suddenly created a whole lot more demand from the iron mines, and more than the iron mines could actually keep up with. And he figured this out right away. And so he also invested in the iron mines so that they would be producing enough ore for this mass production process. And he invested forward into pig iron processing and coal production, key steps and key resources to make steel making possible, absolutely necessary to its success. But until Carnegie came along, each of those were separate businesses, and each of those were separate market relationships that had to be negotiated. Carnegie said, I'll bring the whole supply chain into steel. into Carnegie steel. And so here's your vertical integration. Starting in the 1890s and leading well into the 20th century, not just steel, but several industries saw themselves become subjects of monopoly control through vertical integration and the management hierarchies that allowed that structure to be managed. Carnegie Steel was just the sort of leading edge of that. By the early 20th century, having produced the material to build and rebuild, because every railroad that went in was actually rebuilt within the first couple of years, because the first building was usually shoddy. An entire continent of railroads. Carnegie Steel became the first billion-dollar corporation. Okay, so we got these guys now generating wealth like we literally have never seen before. Let's think for a minute, though, as I just described what Carnegie did, how he and Rockefeller changed capitalism, and they did change capitalism. They removed the kind of Adam Smith invisible hand. And we might note that Alfred Chandler's book was called The Visible Hand. That was a reference to Adam Smith's theory that prices were fair because of all of the exchanges in the marketplace, because everybody who came into the marketplace was seeking to maximize their advantage, and that negotiation created a fair price. You need a lot of market exchanges to make that happen. What Chandler argues, and what we see happen here, is a transformation of that kind of economy to a modern managerial corporation economy. It's not the capitalist economy that had launched this whole effort, but it was a logical extension of its ideals. And its ideals are, how can we maximize profit and how can we maximize wealth production in this space? But when you begin to remove those market exchanges, so you own the ore all the way to the pig iron rails, you own that whole thing, and you get to decide because that's your company. You create a set of circumstances in the economy that are a little bit like, and follow me on this metaphor, playing a Monopoly game, except imagine everybody, I assume, has played Monopoly. It's the game where you try to get real estate and put up hotels and try to take your other fellow players for everything they got, and you win by getting the most properties and the most wealth, right? This was a game actually that was created in the early 20th century to supposed to highlight the evils of capitalism. It was created by a socialist. But then imagine a Monopoly game where each time you start the new game, everyone who won the game before keeps the pieces they had in the previous game. And so you're basically starting where you lost the last time. That kind of more fixed economy, less fluid economy with fewer market exchanges and corporations coming into space and staying permanently in that space, but creating a lot of efficiencies in them, reducing the number of market exchanges, and really literally taking over a whole lot more of the productive economy as individual corporations than ever existed before as well. So this was a consolidation of material resources in an incredibly efficient fossil fuel based management hierarchy corporate system. Okay, that's a big mouthful. But both of those two examples, we see variations of them throughout the economy, and that became the dominant, for the most part, the dominant form through the 20th century. And so we can see here in 1900 the demographic impacts of this second industrial system built on fossil fuel energy, railroad connections, instant telegraph communication. And we might notice, actually, if we look at this map carefully, that they're kind of two United States. There's an eastern industrialized manufacturing, urban, resource-consuming East that grew out of its pioneering agrarianism after 1850. And there's still a sparsely populated, railroad-dependent, resource extraction economy in the West, with, as I mentioned before, a third West Coast population of cities that they're poised to grow, but they're not there yet. We'll have to wait until World War II for that to happen. So the first frontier, pre-1850, had grown out of Jefferson's agrarian ideals and a gradual westering of families and communities on a path to settlement. This second frontier grew out of gold rushes and mineral exploitation and iron and coal and urban industrial demand and demand centers, urban centers, which were growing increasingly efficient resource production and supply industries. Settlement comes eventually in this West in several locations. By 1900, really only in the locations where huge mineral deposits were located. And so for the most part, this Western society continues to be a society on the move through the 19th and into the 20th century, still chasing mineral deposits. And we can see here just really crudely that the population density follows the main trunk lines. And then here it follows the Rocky Mountain front and Utah, the Mormon settlement. That is what the railroads actually looked like, even more so. So they were much denser than that map shows, right? We built up. And you can see kind of, here's the pattern of this. This is 1890. That Midwest is the railroad core, much denser, still fairly spread out as you get to the plains, and then the mountains, still fairly sparse. The 1890s witnessed an unprecedented boom in American city population in the Northeast, and it did establish by this period of time an industrial core of raw material processing and fabrication, machine assembly and manufacture, which was absorbing all of the raw material from the nation and drawing new materials from the world. This tangle of production here in the upper Midwest. It was also producing feed and fuel and increasingly farm animals. And so we're in the middle of this core geography even now, although well past this height. We can, these are the cities that boom. So this industrial core really kind of reaches all the way to Kansas City and Chicago. And it's really urbanized, we can say, in this whole region, although we like to think of ourselves as rural in Ohio. We're pretty urban. And then if we look at it from a topographical view, we just go back and forth. And so it's all the green areas on the map, actually, these relatively low, relatively flat, and then all of the low spaces through the mountains and the low spaces in the West. The railroads filled all of that space. Go back to the red. It filled all of that flat land, available land. And these railroads all created market connections. And we'll say it again, using the iron of Minnesota, the coal of Pennsylvania, the copper of Upper Michigan, and then all of that material supplemented by the mass production of ore to metals in the far West after 1880, the United States economic actors filled up the whole of this. They filled it up with trade, with production, with markets. We were a commercial people. And for half a century, 1880 to 1930, the first 30 years of which railroads were the only game in town, railroads dominated these markets, right? And this is the demographic outcome of that new nation by 1900. This pattern, really heavy Northeast, this core running from through the Midwest, the lower Midwest there, remains in place until World War II. And then we just want to note, I just want to show you a couple of production charts. This whole system did literally grow on the back of the mass production of metals. And here you see the exponential growth that was experienced in copper output, particularly by the mid-1880s when railroads were completed. That blue is Montana, the green is Arizona. The mass production of Western copper just really outpaced the raw material, the native copper that was being produced in Michigan, and was done so to drive down the prices, but did literally drive down the prices and turn copper into the very cheap metal that it would become in the 20th century. And we can see the impacts of this in a new invention that's going to change the world in the 20th century, and that's electrification. When Thomas Edison was trying to figure out if the electric light bulb was possible, the key variable in his estimation was the cost of copper. He knew no copper system could ever be produced on a 25 to 30 cents a pound copper that copper tended to be in the 19th century. With this addition of Western copper in the 1880s, the price of copper plummeted to below 11 cents a pound. And Edison said, I can do it. Aha. And by 1884, he was putting in the Pearl Street Station, which was the world's first electrical generation indoor light system. That was done in lower Manhattan, and was proving that this was available. It was all about overproduction of copper and driving down the price that made electrification possible. Gold production as well, it slowed a little bit. And in fact, when the decline came in the late 1850s, the dependency on gold bullion every year was so great that it led to a panic. And I'll talk about this next time, but there was this fear that the whole economic system was going to collapse if we didn't get more gold. And you can see the 50s peaked until we get to the 90s, where it goes up because of new mass production technologies, but the production is steady through this period. So year after year after year after year, new gold is being injected into this economy all the way to the end of the century. And gold is the standard on which money and economies are based. And the volume grew, and this is really important to pay attention to. So in copper, the volume grew and the price went down. In gold, the volume grew and the price stayed the same, and it stayed the same because the state set the price for gold because gold was money. And so you produced as much gold as you possibly could because you got that price for it because it was fixed and there was no decline in that. What that meant was a growing economy. Coal production as well exponentially took off. And this is just getting started. When we get to electrification, coal production makes this look quaint. Coal consumption makes this amount look quaint. This was coal being used for heat, coal being used for smelting, and coal being used for railroads. And you can see it just grows and grows and grows through the end of the century and into that 20th. And then some of that coal went into iron and steel, which we can see also grew pretty steadily until the 1930s. And boom, you can actually see in steel production the Great Depression. And I actually show you this chart into the 20th century. So you can see how this production of iron, right, that iron itself is a foundational metal in a metal material economy. We use more iron than any other metal by far. The rest are like a fraction of 5%. 95% of our whole metals economy is iron and some alloy. And so that kind of importance means that its availability begins to be a marker of the health of the economy and the health of the society itself. And so we can actually see in this chart the Great Depression and the recovery of World War II just in iron production. And we might note it's a bust and boom economy, up and down, up and down, up and down over the years. But for this period of time, iron was the economy. Iron still is the economy. If you were to remove iron from your world, you would cease to be able to do just about everything you do. It is everywhere. And it turns out there's huge amounts of it on Earth. So we've continued to churn it out. So material production, want to think about the state for just 1 second in all of this. And this gives us insight into the 19th century state. This is about how much debt the federal government carried during particular periods of time. How much was it willing to carry? During the 19th century, the nation state would go up to about 30%, about a third of the GDP, the overall output. The federal government was willing to carry forward, but only for war, right? So you can see that in the 19th century, we could see it subdivided into two major wars with a little blip for the War of 1812. The Revolutionary War, then that little blip in 1812, and then the Civil War, both of whom cost 30% of GDP, but both of which would be paid off, right? The Revolutionary War was paid off by the time the Civil War started. Civil War would be paid off by the end of the century. And it shows that in this period of time, the United States was willing to leverage a fairly significant amount of debt for protection of the geography, protection of the Constitution purposes. Okay. I'm going to shift now to aggregate output. We looked at this at the beginning. This is the volume of trade aggregated each year. This is up through almost the start of World War I. So you can see, you know, pretty steady growth in output. I've noted a couple of dips, a couple of punctuations, periods of recession and even depression. And so we might call this period a period of massive increase in the output and a massive increase in the ability to output, with these periods of economic punctuation. And there's one in 1873, there's one in 1883, there's one in 1893. In fact, every decade of the late 19th century, as this urban industrial resource production system came into being, there were these noted stalls and contractions of growth. We call them depressions, right? Each, you can see, is recovered from. Things get better, even better than they were before they get better. But the experience itself, and we know this from the past year, the experience of economic contractions on a personal level can be horrible. It creates an uncertainty. It can feel like the end of the world. People caught in these circumstances experience this as a kind of really deep personal crisis and a sense of failure in the market economy we live in. They're facing debt that they just can't pay, rent that they're not sure how they're going to come up with, food they can't buy for themselves or their children, children that they can't support, and so on. And in the 19th century, when these economic crises hit the economy, the federal government did nothing. People were left to their own devices in the 19th century, although we'll see in a second, there was some demand that the federal government do something that came by the end of this period. But for the most part, you were left on your own. Grab those bootstraps, kiddies, find a camp spot if you need to, weather through this. But these economic crises, which when they happen are usually blamed on robber barons and others, actually appear to be inherent to the fossil fuel industrialized economic system itself. And this is a really simplified version of what we call Kuznets cycles. Simon Kuznets in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the Global Depression, said, why are we in this again? And he went back and did the economics of it. And he said, there are these repeated patterns of booms and busts, and they seem to be embedded in this fossil fuel resource-based industrialization. And it seems to be connected to the technologies and the productive ability, this enormous growth in productive ability. So there's technological investment in things like railroads and smelters and mass production, which creates this initial boom, so the expansion, and then a boom. But that boom cannot be maintained indefinitely for a whole lot of reasons. The ore runs out. The equipment gets worn out. There are accidents of nature, accidents of human society as well. And these productive areas fall off in their production and consumption, and then they collapse. These boom and bust cycles that we often blame on the industry leaders actually appear to be more systematic. So railroad building ended in 1872 because it was overinflated and it needed a correction. A glut of material drove prices down in 1883-84, leading to a depression. And the same thing in the early 1890s. In that case, the government decided it wasn't going to buy silver anymore for money, which led to a collapse of silver mines in the West, and the entire economy followed. It was this enormous collapse, worse than the 1930s depression in the United States. So in the early 1890s, we're suffering a Great Depression where people are 25% unemployment. People are feeling really, really terrible about things. That's that 1890s recession we see there. And we might just remember this Turner thesis. We might just note that his claim about the closing frontier was written just as this depression was at its bottom. This immediate experience of a national depression, probably more than anything else, led Turner to generalize about a process and about the condition of America, and really about nation making that had ended about 50 years earlier with the end of Jeffersonian's agrarian frontier. And so we want to put Turner in that context. He's really in the midst of this new urban industrial system, wanting a golden age that never was. And this experience not only led intellectuals to reimagine American civilization and think about its end, but it caused extreme stress, particularly in the heartland of Ohio and the upper Midwest. Farmers and laborers felt left out completely. And in 1894, a group of farmers and laborers led by a laborer from Ohio marched on Washington and demanded that the federal government give them money and give them jobs, that they help them out in some way. McKinley, no, this was Cleveland, was not very interested in facilitating Coxey's army. He called out the militia and he chased them out of town, tearing their tents out. And so there was some calls for what would come in the New Deal about 30 years later, but the federal government wasn't there yet. And I want to finish. I know I'm right up on time. I'll be very quick, looking at a couple of the key ideas. Look at this closer again when you can pull down the PowerPoint. This is a depiction of the United States as a human male who's grown from childhood through adolescence, adulthood, and seemingly into a ripe old age. But a ripe old age that is kind of tenuous. He's bloating, he's growing out of his clothes at the end of the century. It's not quite an image of progress. It actually suggests fear and anxiety about the new role, as you see all the hands coming from off screen seeking handouts, and the US kind of having to watch its back and keeping that Navy under its arm. And it was overproduction, in fact, that was believed to have led to the 1890s depression. And this overproduction would be recast, again, we'll see this next week, as a burden to be delivered to the undeveloped world. One last picture, McKinley's 1896 presidency. By the end of the century, the economy becomes the political standard. We'll talk about McKinley a week from now, but prosperity at home, prestige abroad. He's standing atop a gold coin. The gold standard is the ideal money standard for this industrialized system, for these horizontally and vertically integrated corporations. And so what we see here in this one image is the modern Republican Party wedding its fortunes to the titans of industry as the 19th century closed, and economic growth and prosperity becoming an important politicized issue in national party politics going forward. And I'm sorry to keep you long here. Next time, we're going to talk about social change in this era. And your lecture quiz will be available at noon on the Carmen site. I can stick around for a minute if you folks have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you in Riedel 229. We will also have a Zoom feed, but everyone who can be there in person, I'll see you in Riedel 229 on Monday, January 25th, when we'll talk about social change. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.